Susan B. Anthony's story is not just the story of one woman, but the reflection of an entire era in which women had to fight relentlessly for their most basic rights. 19th century America was a world where women were not considered equal to men in law, in society, or in opportunity. Women could not vote. They had almost no political representation, and in most professions, they were denied the freedom to advance on their own terms. After marriage, a woman's property legally belonged to her husband. In such a world, one ordinary woman with extraordinary courage rose to dedicate her entire life to the belief that women must be seen as equals to men. That woman was Susan B. Anthony. She was born in 1820 in Massachusetts, in a Quaker family that valued simplicity, honesty, and justice. Her father, Daniel Anthony, was a mill owner, but also a man of strong principles. Her mother, Lucy Red Anthony, instilled in the children the values of hard work and service. From her earliest years, Susan was a child who asked questions. She often wondered why society placed such a wide gap between men and women, why boys seemed destined for opportunity, while girls were told their place was limited to the home. Her family's Quaker background taught that all human beings were equal in the eyes of God. This gave her an early sense of justice, and it awakened in her a sensitivity to the injustices around her. As she grew older, she began teaching and became a school teacher. It was there that she experienced firsthand the inequality of the system. Male teachers were paid significantly more than women teachers, even though they did the same work. For Susan, this was not just unfair, it was intolerable. The fire of resistance began to grow inside her, and she resolved that this system of inequality must change. During her youth, she became involved in reform movements. She took part in the anti slavery movement, which opposed the cruel institution of slavery, and she also supported the temperance movement, which aimed to limit the destructive influence of alcohol on families. But she soon realized something even more troubling. Women were not even free to raise their voices effectively in these movements. Everywhere she went, women were treated as secondary participants, not as equals. That realization changed her path forever. Susan understood that without political power, without the vote, women's voices would always be dismissed. The life of a woman in 19th century America was tightly confined. After marriage, her earnings automatically became her husband's property. Women could not serve on juries. They could not easily speak in public forums, and in many states, they could not even claim legal custody of their children. The law, the church, and social custom all reinforced her dependency. To Susan, this was not just inconvenient, it was a moral wrong that had to be confronted. Her destiny changed when she met Elizabeth Cady Stanton, a bold reformer already committed to the cause of women's rights. The meeting of these two women was the beginning of one of the most powerful partnerships in American history. Together, they gave new life to the women's rights movement. They traveled from town to town, city to city, delivering speeches and organizing gatherings to awaken women to their own power. The journey was never easy. Crowds often mocked them, audiences sometimes shouted them down, and on several occasions, people tried to physically attack them. Yet Susan remained unshaken. Her voice carried strength, her words carried fire, and her conviction carried the promise that change would one day come. One of the most famous episodes of her life came in 1872 during the presidential election. At that time, women were legally barred from voting. Susan challenged the law directly by casting her ballot in Rochester, New York. For that act of defiance, she was arrested and put on trial. In the courtroom, she argued fiercely that the Constitution gave her the right to vote as a citizen of the United States. The judge found her guilty and imposed a fine. Susan refused to pay, declaring, "If it is a crime to vote, I am willing to commit this crime again and again." This act of defiance echoed across the nation and forced Americans to confront the contradiction between democratic ideals and the exclusion of women. Her struggle was long and exhausting. She knew the full victory might not come in her lifetime, but she never wavered. Through her tireless campaigns, state by state, the tide began to shift. Some territories and states granted women the right to vote, inspired in part by her relentless pressure. When she passed away in 1906, the goal of full suffrage had not yet been achieved. But the seeds she had planted grew strong, and in 1920, with the ratification of the 19th Amendment, American women finally secured the right to vote nationwide. Though Susan did not live to see it, the nation knew that her life's work had made it possible. Her story is remembered not only because of the battles she fought, but because of the vision she carried. She imagined a society in which women were not treated as dependents, but as full citizens, free to speak, free to act, and free to vote. She endured ridicule, arrest, and lifelong resistance, yet her name remains a symbol of courage. Today, her legacy lives on in schools that teach her story, in the currency that once bore her image, and in the continuing fight for equality that traces its roots back to her voice. After her bold decision to vote in 1872, the arrest that followed became one of the most defining episodes of her life. The trial of Susan B. Anthony in 1873 was not just a legal proceeding, it was a political statement. In the courtroom, she stood as a symbol of defiance against a system that silenced women. The judge instructed the jury to find her guilty without even allowing them to deliberate, an extraordinary violation of fairness. When asked if she had anything to say before sentencing, Anthony delivered one of the most powerful speeches of her career. She denounced the trial as a mockery of justice and condemned the government for denying half its citizens the most basic right of democracy. Her words resonated far beyond the courtroom, reprinted in newspapers and stirring debate across the nation. Although she was fined $100, she refused to pay a single cent. That refusal itself became an act of resistance, demonstrating that she would never legitimize an unjust system. This event cemented her reputation as an uncompromising fighter. She was not willing to bend to authority, and that courage inspired others. Among her closest allies was Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist and former enslaved man. Anthony and Douglass shared a deep respect for one another, though at times they disagreed about priorities. After the Civil War, when the question of voting rights for freedmen and women emerged, Douglass argued that black men's suffrage must come first because their lives were in immediate danger. Anthony and Stanton, however, insisted that women must not be excluded. Their disagreements were sharp, yet their shared vision of universal equality kept them linked. The fact that Anthony, a white woman, and Douglass, a black man, could stand together in public in the 19th century was itself a radical statement. challenging the racial and gender hierarchies of the time. Anthony's partnership with Elizabeth Cady Stanton was equally transformative. Stanton was the thinker and writer, drafting declarations and arguments, while Anthony was the organizer and strategist, tirelessly traveling, speaking, and lobbying. They complemented each other's strengths. Together, they edited a newspaper called The Revolution, which boldly declared in its masthead, "Men, their rights and nothing more. Women, their rights and nothing less." Through articles and editorials, they confronted opponents and gave voice to women's frustrations. Though the paper struggled financially and eventually ceased publication, its message left an enduring impact. The campaign for suffrage often required Anthony to endure brutal travel conditions. She rode in overcrowded trains, endured harsh weather, and sometimes arrived in towns where she was greeted with hostility. She faced audiences that laughed at her, threw rotten vegetables, or simply walked out. Yet she persisted. Each insult only strengthened her resolve. She believed that if she could endure humiliation, then no woman would have to endure it forever. In her eyes, personal comfort was meaningless compared to the long-term battle for justice. As decades passed, Anthony witnessed small but significant progress. Western territories, less bound by tradition, began to experiment with suffrage. Wyoming, in 1869, became the first to grant women the right to vote, followed by Utah, Colorado, and Idaho. Anthony celebrated these milestones, using them as proof in her speeches that suffrage would not destroy society, but strengthen it. She reminded skeptics that in those places, families remained intact, communities functioned, and democracy was richer because women's voices were included. Still, progress was painfully slow. For every victory, there were multiple defeats. State legislatures repeatedly rejected suffrage bills. Referendums often failed by wide margins because men, the only voters, were reluctant to share power. Anthony grew older, watching one campaign after another falter, but she never allowed despair to paralyze her. She traveled to Washington, D.C. year after year, petitioning Congress to pass a constitutional amendment. Lawmakers listened politely and then turned away, but she refused to stop showing up. She believed that persistence itself was a weapon. By the time she reached her 70s, she had become a living legend. Younger suffragists admired her discipline and sought her guidance. She trained and inspired a new generation, knowing that she might not live to see the final victory. Her plain appearance, her stern but kind demeanor, and her relentless dedication gave her an almost saint-like aura in the eyes of followers. She never married, devoting her entire life to the cause. Critics mocked her as a spinster, but she wore that insult as a badge of honor, proof that she would not be constrained by society's expectations of womanhood. In her final years, Anthony began to reflect on her journey. She had endured decades of ridicule, arrests, defeats, and disappointments. Yet, she had also seen the transformation of a movement from the margins of society to the center of national debate. She knew that the movement was larger than herself, and that her role was to keep the torch burning until others could carry it forward. At the convention in Baltimore in 1906, too weak to stand for long, she gave her last great words: "Failure is impossible." The phrase captured everything she believed, and it became the rallying cry for the women who continued after her. Her death in March of that year was met with mourning, but also with renewed determination. Suffragists vowed to continue her work, and they did. For 14 more years, they fought until the 19th Amendment was finally ratified in 1920, granting women the right to vote. When that day arrived, many remembered Susan B. Anthony as the woman who had paved the way, the woman who had dared to challenge the system when it seemed unchangeable. Though she never lived to cast a legal ballot, every woman who voted in that first election of 1920 was, in some sense, casting it with her spirit. Her influence did not stop with suffrage. Later generations of feminists, civil rights activists, and advocates for justice looked back to her as proof that one person's unyielding commitment can shift the world. Schools were named after her, statues erected, and in 1979, the U.S. Mint placed her image on the dollar coin, making her the first real woman to appear on U.S. currency. Even in modern times, her grave in Rochester, New York, becomes a site of pilgrimage every election day, with women leaving "I voted" stickers on her tombstone to honor the path she carved for them. Susan B. Anthony's life was not just about winning the vote. It was about teaching the nation that democracy without women was incomplete. Her vision reached beyond her own lifetime, and it continues to shape the struggles for equality that followed. She proved that persistence can outlast prejudice, that courage can outshine ridicule, and that failure truly is impossible when justice is at stake.